right, so this session is called Once and Future Kings. Last time we ended by saying that God's rule in the spiritual realm or the unseen realm is kind of his template for the earthly realm. And so, question to kick things off this evening is, I hope everybody didn't have a lot of reading this time. Genesis and Job, I think were part of your reading, but what comes to mind when you hear or think about the Garden of Eden?
Paradise.
Paradise, okay.
Perfect place that was taken away from us because of evil.
Okay. What if we went a little bit further and said, what comes to mind when you think about what Adam and Eve's purpose was? Like, what were they supposed to do?
They're to be caretakers,
Okay.
take care of the animals and take care of the garden.
Yep. The Garden of Eden served as a base camp for Adam and Eve. And I don't think we think about that enough. Because God made the entire earth, but then it talks about him creating a special garden for them, right? And so that's where they had everything that they needed. The fruits, the vegetables, the different things that he tells them they can eat, those kind of things, they were all in that garden. And so the rest of the world, you could think of it as being kind of untamed, or kind of even a little bit having like chaos, or wilderness, because wilderness is a big theme in the Old Testament, right? We talk about the wilderness journey, Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, and we always associate that with chaos. And so Adam and Eve were to exercise dominion over the animals, and over the vegetation that was in the garden. And so very much like God, when he creates the earth, and it talks about the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, in the ancient Near Eastern mind, waters represented chaos. And so he's creating order out of that chaos. They were supposed to go out into the earth and create order out of chaos, put things into order. And so Adam, he named all the animals that were subject to him, just like God named Adam. And Adam, in case you didn't know, Adam is actually the Hebrew word for man or mankind. And so God names man. And so he names man who was subject to him. And then Adam and his wife Eve, her name that Adam names her is Isha, which means woman or wife. It'll be translated either way in Hebrew. They were to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so that's that idea of going out and bringing order to the chaos. They were to work and keep the garden. Genesis 2:15 talks about that. And work is not only the idea of tilling the soil, planting things, harvesting, reaping, those kind of things. But the word is also used elsewhere to kind of portray the idea of taking into service or placing into submission. Giving purpose would be another way to kind of think about it. So they were supposed to give the ground purpose, and then they were to keep the ground. So like Roger said, they're to watch over it, protect it, be caretakers of it. And then they were to obey God's instructions and rest in his provision. And so that included not only doing the things that I just talked about, accomplishing those things, but also they were to abstain from one thing, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit from that tree. And so Eden served as Adam and Eve's base camp, their base of operations. There's some really good books that you can find that kind of go into more depth about Eden, and it kind of comes into play with what we'll be talking about later, because most scholars believe that there was a mountain and Eden was kind of placed up high on that mountain. And so that mountain was kind of a mountain of God's presence, and Eden is where God would walk with Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening. And so later on, when you get to pretty much every culture, we talked about this in junior camp, when you're, pyramids, ziggurats, those kind of things, it's a man-made mountaintop structure. And that's where they would have the idea that that's where they could meet with the gods. And so a lot of scholars believe that that's where that concept came from, because Eden was up high on the mountain. So Eden was also God's home, and they could hear and see his visible presence. Genesis 3:8 talks about God walking in the garden in the cool of the evening, with them actually coming when after the fall, after they had eaten of the fruit. But there were also other divine beings in the garden. We talked a little bit about this last time, and we'll go in more detail next session for sure, talking about the serpent, and then later on we'll talk more about the cherubim. But there were other divine beings that were in the garden, and it's not that they just, I guess in our minds sometimes maybe we think they just popped up, and we don't think necessarily that they lived there, but that's kind of the point. They were there. And so, again, that's why, this serpent doesn't shock Eve when it begins talking to her, because our minds would say, hey, what's up, talking snake? And so those other beings were there. And so my next question is, why do you think God said, let us make man in our image?
Well, it's a call to the Trinity,
Okay.
because it's laying the groundwork now for, Jesus, the Son, and the Holy Spirit coming after the death. And it's like, instead of being able to be like, oh, he says I and me in the beginning, because words really matter.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like, well, he said this here, he said I,
Right.
but us. So they always have that reference to point back to that.
Yeah. Anybody else got anything?
Well, I think there also had to be certain, it doesn't really directly say what angelic beings or any of that was there at the time, but when Adam and Eve were removed from the garden, cherubim are placed the Garden Eden.
Mm-hmm.
So those were created beings that were already created at that time. So it's just kind of guessing at it. There's possibly those individuals, angelic beings, were created before the earth was fully established. Because the first thing it says, God created the heavens and the earth.
Hmm.
Doesn't say exactly at what point those things were populated. It doesn't. It focuses in on the earth because that's what we know.
Right.
We don't know at what point the heavens and the order within the heavens was established. So it's possible that divine counsel that it's talked about, I think it's Job and a few other places that it's talked about, we don't know when that was initially established. So It could have been at this time as well, as along with the Trinity involved.
Mm-hmm.
So it could have been not only him talking to his own person's selves, but also to the divine counsel that could have been in that moment.
Yeah. And so with both of what you guys said, there have been a couple of suggestions about who the us and our are referring to in Genesis 1:26. Some people have said that it's the Trinity, and so well, even before that, some people have said, well, it was God using a royal we, like a queen would say we or our. referring to herself. But then some people have said, well, it's God conferring with the other members of the Trinity. And so you have God the Father talking with God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And they're the we and the our. But there is the possibility that Dustin just kind of mentioned, that God is speaking also to his divine counsel here. And there's some support for this third option that we'll talk about, but I need to throw a caveat disclaimer out there. This doesn't negate God including all three persons of the Trinity. Does that make sense? So it would be the Trinity plus this, or just the Trinity. And so you have to kind of think, well, it could be the Trinity and just talking about that, or it could be the Trinity and these other members of the divine council. And so the discussion before man is created is in the plural. And so let us make man in our image. If you look at that in Hebrew, the verb to make is plural, along with let us and make man in our image. However, when the act of creation actually happens, and it tells us, and God made man in his own image, the verb there becomes singular. And it's really important to catch on the verb, because it literally says Elohim created man in his own image. And we talked a couple weeks ago about how Elohim is the plural form of El. And so that verb being in the singular goes back to Elohim. That's what it's a direct object, I guess is what you would say, or what it's modifying. And so that's how you know this is the God, not talking about God's plural, but the God made man in his image, singular. And so you're talking about one Elohim, Yahweh, versus many Elohim. And so another thing that I think is interesting too, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but this just popped in my head. I didn't put this in my notes. When we see angels in the Bible, we talk about what do they look like, and usually they have the appearance of a man. And so I think you could say, hey, maybe this is the case because they look like men, and so that's part of that image thing as well. But my next question is, who was present when God created the earth? And Dustin's already jumped ahead and talked about this. I'll pull up Job. That was part of your reading assignment. Job 38, 4-7. God is talking to Job here. It says, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? So sons of God and morning stars, those are the same way of saying the same group of people. But the sons of God were involved in creation to some extent, to some degree. And when we think about that, we have to remember God, Yahweh alone, is the creator of all things, because he's the only one that has the power to create. No examples in the Bible ever of any other gods creating anything, or demons or those kind of beings in the New Testament having any kind of power like that. So only God is the creator. But the sons of God were present, and they kind of marveled and, were in awe of his work. They celebrated his work. And so as humans, we are made in God's image, but so were those other beings on his council. And what I mean by that is we're not like plants and we're not like animals. We have dominion. We have a purpose. God has a plan for us, a purpose for creating us. And so in a limited sense, we are also involved in participating in carrying out God's work on earth, right? Would everybody agree with that? I mean, it's pretty obvious, Great Commission, right? Go out and make disciples of all nations. And that's no different. It looks a little different, but those divine beings are also involved in God's work, right? We talked about that a couple of weeks ago when we looked at King Ahab and the angel volunteering to put a bad word in the prophet's mouth, a deceptive word. We talk about that when we talk about Daniel and the angel Michael being sent with a message to give him. And so they're also involved in God's work. And so in the New Testament, eventually God shows us the ultimate example of representing God and being in his image, and that is Jesus. And so God the Son comes to us in human form, and he's perfectly obedient to the Father. He does everything that the Father wills, and he refrains from doing anything that would break his law or go against his will. And so we are now to imitate him, and one day we'll be fully conformed to his image and be like him. And so humanity is supposed to be God's administration or counsel on earth. We were made to live with God in his presence, with his heavenly family. We talk about how that's what got disrupted in Eden, is God's heavenly and earthly family were all there, and that's what got disrupted. And so both human and divine beings were created to enjoy God and serve him forever. And Eden was where heaven and earth intersected or converged, and that's going to be important because that's going to come out later in our study. Because now that's us, right? We're God's temple, and so Adam and Eve were to be stewards over God's creation, and they're basically their task that God gave them was to extend Eden, make Eden grow until it filled the earth, and the earth was full of God's image bearers. I don't know if you ever heard Tyler talk about that, but he brought out one time, and it's true, the word image there in Genesis is also used of idols later. And so we are kind of like living idols to represent the God that we serve. Because that's what idols were, right? They represented the God that people were worshiping, and we're supposed to represent the God that we worship. And so, but they failed and were kicked out of Eden, in God's family, God's kingdom space, as it were. And so God stations those a cherubim and a flaming sword from his counsel to guard Eden. And basically, we'll see this later, but the cherubim, I think I already mentioned this, that they're throne room guardians. That's their whole purpose. That's where we see them in the Old Testament. Every time we see cherubim and seraphim, they're around the throne room. They're guardians of the throne room, keeping people away in the tabernacle, in the temple. When we talked about the Ark of the Covenant, you have the cherubim wings. When you go into the tabernacle, on the curtains, there were pictures depicting the cherubim. And so that was like, do not pass. This is God's presence. You can't go here. We're guarding this. And so Adam and Eve and the serpent are cursed, and they're sent out from God's presence. But God has not given up on his original plan. Humanity, even after the flood, happens, God tells Noah, his family, his sons' wives, to be fruitful and multiply again. We have that same kind of language. And then when we get to Abraham, he's not told to be fruitful and multiply, but he is told, I'm going to make you the father of many nations, and by all nations you'll be blessed. And so again, it's that idea of getting back to this extended, large, global family of God's people. And so now if we trust Jesus, we're adopted into that family and we become sons and daughters of God. And so in essence, humanity reveals either one of two ways of living. Our lives reveal one of two ways of living. We either display a glimpse of what it's like to live in communion with God, in God's presence, be reunited with Him, or we demonstrate what life is like separated from God's presence. And that's seen in how we live. That's what other people are seeing in our lives. And so I snuck these in here before I'm actually done, because I realized as I was going through this, I would be answering some of these. And so I wanted you guys to discuss them a little bit. So our post-session question 1, would you include free will as an attribute humans share with God? If so, why did God create us with free will? I'll put that up there, sorry.
Different way of putting the idea of free will, the idea that we share that with God. I guess I never made that connection, but it would make sense. If we had, I do believe that we have free will, but a different version of free will, because we are able to make the choices that we make. We're not able to see the consequences of our choices beforehand. God can. I think that's the difference between our free will and His free will.
Yes.
He knows what He's going to do, and He knows the effects that those things are going to do.
Yeah, and
that same access to that knowledge.
You can go down a big rabbit hole with that too, because God has unlimited ultimate free will, because if He wants to create something, He can.
Yeah.
We may want something, but we can't make
free
it
will,
happen.
but it's limited free will
Yeah.
in a sense of we're bound by our inability to create and eliminate. Basically,
Yeah.
there are limitations to our free will. But why He would create us with that, I always go back to the idea of He wants us to choose that relationship with Him.
Yeah.
And, if He wanted to make a bunch of robots, it would have been a lot easier and a lot less headache than what He ended up doing.
Yeah.
And but to truly feel love in return by something out of their own will to do that is different than making somebody specifically only be able to function within that mindset of love.
Yeah.
It's not the same.
Anybody else? So, to me, without free will, I don't think you could have things like love or self-sacrifice, right? Because you'd be programmed, and there would be no option. So there would be, you're not sacrificing anything. You're programmed to do something. And so, yeah, I think you're on point there. And so my next question, because this happened to me one time with my son. So I'm going to ask you this: how would you respond to someone who asserts that humans do not have free will because God already knows everything that we do?
Knowledge about them doesn't necessarily mean that it's still not a choice has been made. I can know that if she decides to do a backflip off this chair, it's not going to end well for her, but she could still do it.
Yeah.
I think there's a difference between him knowing the outcome doesn't change the fact that we still had to make a choice to do the action.
Yeah. And that was hard for Corbin to grasp when we were talking about it at first. I think he finally got it. Yeah. But
I struggled with that concept until I had children. because it very rarely do they absolutely shock you with what they do. I feel like you know them so well that you can, I would say with about 75% certainty, know their choices, their reactions. And so it's like, I can look at, my kids and say, hey, do you want broccoli or do you want carrots? And, I can pick and put on their plate what I think they're going to want. And it's like, just because I can know them that well, why do we think that the God who created us wouldn't know us that well?
Yeah. And I think the key to understanding that is when we talk about free will, we're talking about the choice, not the consequence. The choice is free. You're free to decide that, but the consequence or what happens later, God knows. And so it's not like you're locked in. You could have made a different decision, but God knows you so well, and God knows everything that, in His mind, it's kind of locked in. But in the moment, you're still making a choice. And I think it goes back to that thing where, we talk about God. We're talking about someone who transcends space and time, and that's hard for us to grasp. That He is outside of all of that. And so I found a quote that kind of wraps up, why God created us with free will, not only because it's made in His image, but going back to what Dustin said. I don't know who said this. You can look it up and see if you're interested, but the quote goes, if you love somebody, let them go. If they return, they were always yours. And if they don't, they never were. Have y'all heard something like that before? And so that's kind of the thing. Is God wants a relationship with us, not programmed robots. And so our free will allows for the possibility of love, self-sacrifice, but that also means there's potential for things to go wrong, right? For it to have a dark side. Free will gives us the ability to make good choices, but it also gives us the ability to make the wrong choice, to reject God's love, to reject God's provision, to rebel against Him, and that's what could and did go wrong in the Garden of Eden. In Genesis 3:22, after the fall, going back to that kind of plurality of language, we see the same language found earlier that we saw in Genesis 1. Genesis 3:22, then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and also take of the tree of life and eat and live forever. God says we're going to exile him and put him out of the garden. And so here God is talking, but again, the question is, who is He telling to look for? Behold, look at this. He's either again speaking to Himself, the three persons of the Trinity, or He's also including that divine counsel. I think we have to say that that's a possibility. Since we are, and this is where my mind went as I was refreshing myself this week. Since we are told to work or give purpose, and we're told to guard the earth, I don't think it's far-fetched that God's counsel was supposed to help give us purpose and guard us, and they didn't do that, and we failed to obey God, and that's where things went sour. And so notice that after God says this, God stations the cherubim at the guard post. And so if He could be talking to that cherubim that he stationed there. And so our free will can produce disastrous results for Adam and Eve. It meant they were free to be disobedient, and their rebellion in the garden was eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge. But next time we're going to talk about, that's the rebellion that we're all the most familiar with, right? But next time we're going to talk about another uprising in the garden that preceded Adam and Eve are kind of came maybe even simultaneously. We'll talk about revisit the garden of the talking snake. And then from there, we'll go on and talk about another divine rebellion that happens in Genesis. And this is why reading the Bible and reading the entirety of Scripture really pays off and really helps us understand parts of the story, because you get part of the story in Genesis, but then you get an explanation for what happened in Genesis and Deuteronomy. And so if you don't read past Genesis, if you're like most people and you start off that Bible year reading plan or something and you get to Leviticus and you're like, no, I'm done with this. I can't do this. Or you get to Numbers or something like that, then you've never made it that far. And so you miss some of these things and how they tie together. But the story does keep weaving itself and going back and referring to things. And so that's what we'll be looking at. So does anybody have any questions or comments for tonight? I know this was a little bit of a shorter session.
Still kind of stuck on that idea of free will being a shared attribute of God. I guess that kind of like the way I was thinking of it, it's like we're a unique creation within creation. It's like the animals and the other things that are on the earth aren't the same as how we are.
Yeah.
We think differently. Animals, when you really interact with animals, yeah, they might have a certain personality to them, but they're really only driven by certain
Instinct.
instinct.
We call that
driven
instinct.
stuff.
Yep.
And us, we're driven more by free will and some kind of innate desire within us that was created in us, but placed in us.
Yeah.
And whether we understand what that desire is or not, it's there.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that's that pursuit of what God shared with us with it from himself to
Yeah.
give us that image of him within us. So it really kind of shifted how I look at that.
And like we're going to talk about how we're not programmed. Scientists have been talking about, well, why do birds follow migratory patterns and what lets them know when it's time to leave? And it's programmed in them. I mean, they are programmed. We're not.
We don't migrate. We really don't operate. You could say we can operate in certain fashions similar to some animals, but really the motivations are entirely different. And I'm sure there's times in history that it was similar animalistic, driver. But I don't think there's even if you take the most, not secular based mentality about it, there is a definitive difference between humanity and all other creatures on this planet.
Yeah.
And just how we approach everything. Like you said, everything else is instinct. What happened if God was not involved in creating us specifically with that in us? What part of the evolution process caused that change to suddenly happen in this one specific group?
Yeah.
Within this one specific animal group.
Yeah.
If you're going that route.
We're in the, if you talk to an evolutionist, the question would be, where in the evolutionary line did consciousness happen?
Right.
Yeah.
I always sleep on that place.
Or conscience. Yeah. See, and then the other part of that, I've heard people talk, and this makes sense too. Like when you talk about God having free will, he didn't have to create, but he chose to. He didn't have to send his son, but he chose to. But then on the flip side of that, when you think about, is there anything that God is bound to where he kind of doesn't have free will? There is, in a sense, because he's bound to his character.
Yeah.
He can never betray who he is.
There's always those questions: can God create a rock
Yeah,
big
yeah.
he can't lift, and those
Yeah.
kind of just
So there's some really
weird ones. But yeah.
cool stuff to think about when you think about stuff like that. Anybody else have anything? All right. Thank you guys for joining us. And we'll see you next time.